Okay, so the next section of the course, now we're actually getting into the biology of it all, but you're going to actually see that chemistry still pops up, which is why we needed to review all of that stuff in the first place. So the next section is we're going to deal with all of the major biomolecules, so the molecules in living things, and they can also be called macronutrients. And you're going to find that there's a lot of information coming at you in this next section. So we're going to break it down into 4 or 5 different types of macronutrients, but within each of those, there's a lot to remember. So I'm going to try and highlight along the way for with each note. But the other thing I wanted to mention too is once we've completed a section and say we're ready for a quiz or a test, I will post the PDF documents of my notes so that you don't have to go back and scroll through videos to try and study. I will post those after we've completed them all. So you'll have that to go back and just get the text out of it if you need it. Okay, so we're going to start off with carbohydrates. One important thing to know about carbohydrates is this right here. They contain only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it's always in the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. And I see a spelling mistake here that I just need to fix. Okay, ratio. So that means for every 1 carbon we have 2 hydrogens and 1 more oxygen. That's what makes up a carbohydrate. So one thing you're going to be expected to do by the time we finish going through each of these biomolecules is to be able to look at the chemical structure of each of these and identify them. So you should be able to look at a list of biomolecules and tell me this is a carbohydrate, this is a protein, this is an amino acid based on the things that we're talking about right now. So carbohydrates will always have only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it'll be in that ratio. So carbohydrates can be broken down into main categories. The first category is monosaccharides. And the nice thing about biology, at least science in general actually, is that a lot of the terms have meaning to them. Whenever you see them, they're always going to mean the same thing. So mono stands for 1, saccharide stands for sugar. So 1 sugar. And that's where the term monosaccharide comes from. So they're distinguished by the number of carbons and type of carbonyl group. They form linear chains when dry, but rings when they're dissolved. So this is important too. Linear chains means just a long line of these carbons rather than wrapped up into a chain. But when they're put in water, this is what they form. So during ring formation, the hydroxyl group attached to the C, okay, so each of these are carbons and they've numbered them so that when we talk about them, we know what carbon we're talking about. So the hydroxyl group that's attached to the carbon number 1 determines whether it's one of 2 types of glucose. So we have such thing as an alpha glucose and a beta glucose. And what they're trying to say here is that we know whether we're dealing with an alpha versus a beta based on this hydroxyl group right here. So the hydroxyl group attached to the C1 sugar. So here's our C1 sugar. The hydroxyl group attached to it is below the plane. Okay, if you were looking at it sort of from a side view, this hydroxyl group would be below this ring formation. And in a beta, we're still looking at carbon number 1, this hydroxyl group would be above the plane. This would be like if you were resting a ring on a table, the hydroxyl group would be sticking up from the table, and this would be down below. It's hard to talk about 3-dimensional things on a flat piece of paper. Okay, the next thing is isomers. The term isomers are molecules with the same chemical formula but different arrangements of atoms. So here's a perfect example here. If you were to go through and count how many carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, and oxygen atoms, both of these molecules will have the same thing, but they're arranged differently, so we call them isomers of each other. Okay, the next category of carbohydrates. We're kind of just starting small and getting bigger as we go. So the next term that they use is oligo. Oligo means few, so now we're talking about a few sugars that have come together and bonded. So sugars containing 2 or 3 simple sugars attached by what's called a glycosidic linkage. And a glycosidic linkage is formed from, if you recall from our last note, what we call a condensation reaction. So we have 2 simple sugars here, okay, glucose and glucose. And if they're going to come together through a condensation reaction, one of them has to lose a hydroxyl group, one of them has to lose a hydrogen group. And so that they can form that bond in between, and in the process, water comes off. So this is a classic condensation reaction. So in our last note, we were just looking at general reaction types. When we go through each type of macronutrient, we're going to look at specific examples of that. Of those types of reactions. So a glycosidic linkage is formed through a condensation reaction. And one other thing I forgot to remember too. So oligo means few, so it could be 2 or 3 or 4, but there is also another term for 2. So if it's just 2, in this case, we would call this a disaccharide. Di meaning 2, saccharide meaning sugar. So we've got a glycosidic linkage between 2 simple sugars. We're going to call that a disaccharide. It would fall under either of these 2 categories, oligo or di. Okay, next one up. Now we're talking about lots and lots of simple sugars bonded together. We use the term poly. So poly means many. Sugars containing, now we're talking several hundred to several thousand simple sugars. They can be straight chained or they can be branched. And they basically, when we get to sugars that are this big, we're talking about large carbohydrates that are for 2 main functions. 1, energy storage. And 2, a lot of times in plants, for structural support. Remember learning in grade 10, maybe even 11, about plants having that extra cell wall. That's part of the carbohydrate structure that provides them support. Okay, but when we're talking about plants versus animals, plants have a carbohydrate called cellulose. Animals, or us, store our energy in the form of glycogen. Okay, and I think I have 2 pictures here. So plant cells, remember we just talked about this cell wall. If you recall, the cell wall is only found in plant cells or plant organisms. So when we talk about what that plant cell wall does, it's kind of like if we were to compare it to our bones. Our bones are what hold us upright. The cell wall is what holds a plant upright. So you would need a really big structure, complex structure that's going to provide you with that structure and support. So this is just an example of how many different sugar molecules can come together to form these what we call complex carbohydrates. So that's in plants. And in animals, this would be an example of glycogen. So really the idea to take away here is when we're talking about hundreds and thousands of simple sugars coming together, we're talking about complex carbohydrates. And plants, definitely something to remember, deal with cellulose in their systems. Animals, or us, we deal with glycogen in the form of our energy storage and support. So something interesting about carbohydrates that you might be able to relate to, that both starch and cellulose are composed of glucose molecules. But humans are only able to use the energy from starch because we lack the enzyme needed to break apart the glycosidic linkage in cellulose. So if you think, so this is just to break it down and make it a little bit easier, if we think about eating things like plants, like so our salads, for instance, they contain cellulose, and it doesn't really provide an important benefit to us if we can't digest it and bring it into our digestive system. But there is a different benefit that it performs for humans. Basically what happens is it's called roughage, and it scratches the surface of your large intestine as it works through, and it helps to eliminate waste coming through, but also stimulates your intestinal walls to release mucus to help lubricate and move things through a little bit quicker. Whereas animals, on the other hand, some animals like cows and rabbits contain a certain bacteria that will actually help them break those down, so they can actually use plant cellulose as a source of energy.